March the 16th, 2008. A gray London morning. Metropolitan police officers approached a residential building on Great Portland Street, their footsteps deliberate, their faces unreadable. They moved up the interior staircase toward a flat registered to a 21-year-old male student. The moment they pushed through the door, something felt immediately wrong. Not chaos, something subtler, stranger than that. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, still half full, as if its owner had simply stepped away for a moment. Clothing lay strewn across the floor, but it was what lay beneath all of it that would change everything. Scattered across the floorboards, barely visible to the untrained eye, were droplets of blood, a thin crimson thread that moved deliberately through the hallway, curling toward the stairwell beyond the front door. The officers followed it, down the stairs, past each landing, until the trail came to an abrupt stop at a basement door sealed with a heavy iron padlock. No keys had been recovered anywhere in the flat above. They forced it open. The room beyond was consumed by darkness, the air stale and thick, the floor invisible beneath layers of broken materials, chunks of cement, discarded wood, old construction waste. One detective swept his flashlight in a slow arc, and then the beam stopped. Reaching out from beneath the rubble was a human hand. Working with careful precision, the officers began removing the debris piece by piece. What they uncovered beneath it was the body of a young woman. Partly clothed, bearing visible trauma, she lay motionless amid the dust and broken concrete. And yet something about her face held a haunting kind of stillness. The silver shimmer of her eye makeup, applied 2 nights earlier in preparation for a celebration she never made it home from, was still there, faintly gleaming in the torchlight. The search for a missing person was over. A murder investigation had just begun. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Leave a comment below and tell me which country you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. Your support really means a lot. Now, let's get back to the story. To understand how this young woman came to be buried beneath rubble in the basement of a stranger's building, the story must rewind, not by days, but by hours that will never be recovered. There were no warning sirens, no moments of obvious danger. The night that took her life began as something beautiful. It began with music and laughter and the particular fleeting joy of finishing something hard. It began on a Thursday evening, bleeding into the early hours of Friday, March 14th, 2008, when students from the prestigious Regents Business School gathered to celebrate the end of their winter examination season. Their venue of choice was Maddox, a private members club nestled below street level on Mill Street, deep in the heart of Mayfair. Maddox was not the kind of place you wandered into. Entry required either membership or a connection to someone who mattered. Underground, dimly lit, draped in exclusivity, it was a space where tables were booked for thousands of pounds per evening, where champagne arrived without being ordered, and where a certain class of London society came to feel invisible to the rest of the world. The regular clientele included the sons and daughters of Middle Eastern dynasties, European aristocracy, and the city's moneyed elite. And on this particular evening, among those who moved through the crowd with ease and brightness, was Martine Vik Magnuson. At 23, she was the kind of person who commanded attention without demanding it. The top student in her class, a radiant Scandinavian woman, confident without arrogance, warm without naivety. She had planned her outfit carefully, elegant, stylish, and paired it with shimmering silver eye makeup that caught the light every time she laughed, which was often. In the VIP area, amid the bass and the clink of crystal, someone else appeared who knew her well. Farouk Abdulhak. He was not a stranger passing through. He was her classmate, and far more specifically, the eldest son of one of Yemen's wealthiest men, a billionaire whose fortune had been built on exclusive Coca-Cola bottling rights across the country. Farouk Abdulhak dressed the part of a man accustomed to privilege, sharp tailoring, an air of effortless composure. He was known among their social circle as charming in a measured, controlled way. That evening, he rarely strayed far from Martine's side. He bought her drinks. He leaned in close when he spoke. He performed the old-fashioned gestures of a man trying very hard to make an impression. By approximately 2:30 in the morning, the energy at Maddox began to slow. Several guests drifted toward the exits or made plans to continue elsewhere. Martine's friends noticed her speaking with Farouk Abdulhak as the group began to thin. She was seen leaving alongside him. Nobody was alarmed. They shared a university, shared social spaces, shared mutual friends. If anything, the assumption was benign, that he was perhaps offering her a lift, or that the night simply wasn't finished yet for either of them. Martine's expression, as those who saw her recalled, held no trace of fear. She walked out into the London night beside the heir to a vast fortune, relaxed and smiling. No one who saw her leave would ever see her alive again. By early Friday morning, in the compact shared apartment where Martine lived with 3 friends, 2 of her flatmates woke up to an unfamiliar silence. Nena Muteba and Cecilia Fjellhoy moved through the flat and noticed something immediately. Martine's bed was untouched, the covers smooth, the pillow undisturbed. She clearly hadn't slept there. At first, neither woman spiraled into worry. A long night out often led to informal detours. Perhaps she was sleeping somewhere nearby, or had gone for an early breakfast with someone. The morning moved on without her, but by that evening, the absence had grown heavier. The group had made plans to reconvene at a bar around 10 o'clock, a casual continuation of the exam season celebrations. Martine Vik Magnuson, who was known among her friends for her Norwegian reliability, for always showing up on time, always following through, did not appear. Her phone rang out again and again, and no one answered. What had felt like a mild oddity that morning began to crystallize into something far more frightening by nightfall. Nena and Cecilia rushed back to the apartment, half hoping they'd find her asleep inside. The flat was empty, cold, exactly as they'd left it. They made a decision, one that would later prove to be both brave and heartbreaking in its futility. They would not wait for the conventional 48-hour window that was often informally expected before a missing person report could be filed. Something in the particular quality of Martine's absence was telling them not to wait. They printed a photograph, recent, clear, on their home printer, grabbed a marker, and walked to the nearest police station. On the reverse of the photograph, they wrote 2 things: the name of the man Martine had last been seen with, and his home address. A luxury apartment building, 222 Great Portland Street. Standing at the duty desk, they explained everything to the officer on shift. Martine had left the club with this man. She hadn't had money for a taxi. She was completely out of contact, and nobody had seen or heard from her since. The response they received would haunt them for years. Routine, dismissive. The officer, worn down by the particular rhythms of a Friday night in central London, a night full of young people making unpredictable choices, suggested that Martine was most likely still out somewhere, sleeping it off, and that the sensible thing would be to return in the morning. Nobody was dispatched to Great Portland Street. The photograph sat at the desk, unacted upon. Back at the apartment, Nena and Cecilia understood that official help was not coming, at least not yet. So they began to investigate on their own terms. If Martine wasn't picking up her phone and the police weren't moving, then there was only one remaining thread to pull. They opened a laptop and navigated to Farouk Abdulhak's Facebook profile. They were looking for anything: a status, a photo, a comment, something that might suggest where he had gone after leaving the club or what had happened in the hours since. What they found stopped them cold. Posted at 4 o'clock in the morning, less than an hour after Farouk Abdulhak and Martine had been seen leaving Maddox side by side, was a public update on his profile. 4 words: Farouk Abdulhak is home alone. It didn't read like an ordinary social post. It felt constructed, deliberate, like a timestamp placed not for friends, but for the record. He was broadcasting his solitude to the world at the exact moment when questions about Martine's whereabouts were beginning to form. He had left the club with her, and now, barely an hour later, he wanted the internet to know he was at home and that he was alone. The inconsistency was shattering. Shaking, the 2 women found Martine's address book, located her father's contact number, and dialed. While forensic teams worked below in the building's basement, detectives combed through the apartment directly above. On the surface, the flat appeared lived in, furniture in place, nothing immediately overturned. But as investigators began checking through storage, drawers, and wardrobes, a different picture emerged. Every item of personal significance had been removed: passport, wallet, mobile phone, Most of his clothing, in particular the expensive suits he was so frequently seen wearing, were gone. This wasn't the profile of someone who had stepped out temporarily. This was the methodical clearance of a space by someone who had no intention of returning to it. Whatever had happened here, the person responsible had known in advance that they would need to disappear. In the otherwise stripped-back living space, one object remained, a woman's top, crumpled on the floor. It was cross-referenced immediately against the photograph that Martine's friends had left at the police station hours earlier. The fabric pattern was unmistakable. It was the same top Martine had worn to Maddox on the night she vanished. That single garment became the first concrete physical thread connecting the missing student to this apartment and to whatever had taken place inside it. To formally establish identity, forensic scientists conducted a rapid DNA comparison. Martine's flatmates provided her toothbrush and hairbrush. The biological profiles matched the samples recovered from the body in the basement without ambiguity. And at Heathrow Airport, a flight from Oslo was disembarking. Martine's parents, Odd Petter Magnuson and Kristen Magnuson, had traveled to London to assist in the search for their daughter. Before they could even clear the terminal, they were met by officers from Scotland Yard and escorted directly to the city morgue. The identification was swift and devastating. Odd Petter Magnuson entered the room, looked at the face of the young woman on the table, and confirmed what every parent hopes never to know. His daughter, 23 years old. The postmortem examination reached its conclusion. The cause of death was compression to the neck. Martine Vik Magnuson had been strangled. Before she was a name in an investigation, she was a person, a specific, irreplaceable person with a particular way of filling a room. Martine had grown up on Nesøya, a quiet, affluent island community on the outskirts of Oslo. Her family gave her comfort and security, but more importantly, they gave her drive. She was raised to work for what she wanted, to treat ambition not as a trait, but as a discipline. Her academic journey had not been a straight line. She had initially pursued medicine, enrolling at a university in Warsaw, Poland. After 7 months, she recognized the mismatch and made the difficult decision to change course entirely, withdrawing from the program and relocating to London to study international business at Regent's College. London suited her completely. She moved into a shared apartment with 3 Norwegian friends, and their home became a kind of orbit for a wider social world. Always full, always animated. Martine was the connective tissue of that group, the person who remembered everyone's plans, smoothed over small tensions, and ensured that no one was left out. She was the engine of the household, and it seemed of every room she entered, and none of it came at the expense of her studies. Just the day before her disappearance, she had received confirmation that she had placed first in her class academically. She was at the highest point of her young life, brimming with what lay ahead. But that same quality, her openness, her willingness to look for the good in the people around her, would prove, in the end, to be the thing that placed her in danger, because it led her to give the benefit of the doubt to a man who had long since decided that her goodness was something he was owed. Farrukh Abdulhaq was, on the surface, just another wealthy international student making his way through London's social landscape. In reality, he occupied a different category entirely. His father, Shahir Abdulhaq, controlled the bottling and distribution rights for Coca-Cola throughout Yemen, an enterprise worth billions. The family's wealth operated at a scale that most people never encountered, and it had shaped Farrukh's understanding of the world in ways that would prove deeply dangerous. A story from his adolescent years in Egypt captured his worldview with unsettling clarity. Arriving at a wrestling training session behind the wheel of a car while visibly intoxicated, he was confronted by his coach. Rather than showing remorse or embarrassment, Farrukh dismissed the concern with a single sentence. "It doesn't matter," he said. He had diplomatic immunity. That sense of untouchability, of existing outside the consequences that governed ordinary people, had not diminished by the time he arrived in London. He had met Martine approximately 8 months before the night in question. Those around the pair noticed his intensity toward her early on. The constant messages, the persistent attempts to steer their relationship toward something she had never indicated she wanted. Martine managed it with characteristic kindness. She saw in him a young man made lonely by a rigid, demanding father, and she responded with empathy and friendship, drawing a line clearly but gently. Then, a month before the events at Maddox, Farouk crossed it. He attempted to kiss her. Martine pulled back and explained plainly that her feelings for him were those of friendship only. For a man who had been raised to believe that wanting something badly enough was equivalent to deserving it, this was not a response he was capable of accepting. He absorbed it outwardly. Beneath the surface, something had shifted permanently. Investigators working backward through the final hours of Martine's life were eventually able to reconstruct an almost minute-by-minute account. The evening of Thursday, March 13th, 2008, had begun as a genuine celebration. Martine had taken care with her appearance. A deliberate, stylish outfit, the silver eye makeup that would later identify her even in the worst of circumstances. Inside Maddox, photographs captured what the night looked and felt like: energy, warmth, ease. In one image, Martine's arm rests casually across Farouk Abdulhak's shoulders, a gesture of relaxed, unguarded friendship from a woman who trusted the person beside her. He stands close, attentive, his expression harder to read. He stayed near her throughout the entire evening. As the night moved past 3 o'clock in the morning and the group began the gradual process of leaving, Martine chose to stay on. The celebration felt unfinished to her. Farouk suggested they move the evening to his apartment, just a short distance away on Great Portland Street. It was a perfectly reasonable-sounding proposal between two people who knew each other well. Martine walked her friends to the taxi rank, embraced them goodnight, and doubled back. Security footage from outside the club, captured approximately 20 minutes later, recorded the two of them walking together toward his car, arm in arm, unhurried. Martine's posture, her movement, the way she carried herself, showed none of the tension of someone who felt unsafe. She stepped into the car willingly, with a man she had no reason to fear. That footage was the last record of her alive. Forensic reconstruction of what followed inside that apartment described a night that turned, with terrible speed, from ordinary to violent. The investigation concluded that a confrontation arose between them almost immediately after they were alone together. The nature of that confrontation spoke directly to what Farouk Abdulhak had carried into the evening. Martine resisted him. Evidence gathered from the scene and from the examination of her body told the story of a woman who did not give up. She had been found partially unclothed, her jeans and undergarments removed, yet the injuries across her body, the bruising along her arms and torso, the abrasions on her face, were consistent with prolonged, desperate physical resistance. She had clawed and fought with everything available to her against someone with a significant physical advantage who had decided he would not be refused a second time. The blood that had traced that faint but crucial trail through the stairwell had originated in those moments, in the struggle, in the impact of her resistance. And when it became clear to Farouk Abdulhak that Martine would not stop fighting and that the situation was slipping toward something he could not contain, he made a decision that was neither panicked nor accidental. He closed his hands around her throat. The forensic examination of her neck showed the depth and deliberateness of the grip. The marks left behind spoke to sustained, concentrated pressure, applied until breathing became impossible, and her body finally, irreversibly, stilled. The apartment went silent. What came next was carried out with a composure that investigators found deeply disturbing. Farouk Abdulhak lifted Martine's body. The wounds she had sustained during the struggle were still seeping, and as he transported her from the apartment and into the stairwell, those injuries left a trail of blood on the steps, each drop a record of the path he took, a breadcrumb, marking his movement downward through the building. He brought her all the way to the basement, carrying her into that dark, debris-strewn space, and he buried her, methodically, covering her with lumps of broken concrete and construction materials until she was completely concealed beneath a gray, silent weight. Then he locked the basement with a padlock, climbed back up to the apartment, and in the rush to clean the space, missed entirely the blood he had left on the staircase. He sat down at his computer. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, he typed and posted his update, "Home alone." A digital alibi manufactured in the minutes following the worst thing a person can do. Cold, precise, and, as it turned out, catastrophically incriminating. Then he started to pack. He already knew what was coming. When the body was discovered, the interval between that moment and his arrest would be determined entirely by speed. He intended to be unreachable long before any of that happened. The hours that followed unfolded along two parallel tracks. On one, Martin's friends grew increasingly desperate, making call after call to a phone that would never be answered again. On the other, Farouk Abdulhak executed his exit from Britain with remarkable efficiency. Phone records from those early Friday hours revealed a concentrated pattern of international calls to family in Egypt made in rapid succession. At 5 o'clock in the morning, barely 60 minutes after posting his Home Alone update, he appeared at the door of a London acquaintance's flat. The friend later described him as visibly unsettled, agitated in a way that was difficult to explain. They sat together briefly. He smoked. He left without staying. By 9:30 that morning, at the very moment Martin's flatmates were beginning to truly panic, Farouk Abdulhak made a final call to another acquaintance, stating simply that he was leaving the UK immediately due to a family matter. That was his last communication made. From British soil, he arrived at Heathrow Airport less than 12 hours after departing Maddox, and he boarded a commercial flight bound for Cairo. There is a grim symmetry to what was happening simultaneously. At that same hour, his father, billionaire Shaher Abdulhak, was on a business trip in Norway, the country where the young woman his son had just killed was born and raised. Upon receiving his son's contact, Shaher Abdulhak canceled all remaining meetings and flew immediately to Egypt. Father and son met in Cairo. Within days, they had transferred to Yemen, specifically to the capital city of Sana'a, aboard the family's private jet. By the time Scotland Yard officers broke the padlock on that basement door on Sunday morning, the suspect was already thousands of miles away, shielded by geography, money, and the walls of a legal system that could not reach him, because Yemen's constitution prohibits the extradition of its own nationals. Full stop. British authorities moved quickly. An international arrest warrant was issued, and Farouk Abdulhak's name was placed on Interpol's Red Notice list, meaning any attempt to cross an international border outside Yemen would trigger immediate detention. But inside Yemen, he was effectively immune. No treaty existed between the two countries that could compel his handover. Shaher Abdulhak understood this perfectly, and he reinforced his son's position with the full weight of his resources, retaining a formidable legal team whose singular purpose was to delay, obstruct, and ensure that no pathway to accountability ever fully formed. As pressure built from the British and Norwegian governments, Shaher Abdulhak agreed to meet with former Norwegian Prime Minister Kjell Magne Bondevik. In that meeting, witnesses recalled, the billionaire wept openly. He spoke about the anguish the situation had caused his family. He offered promises of cooperation and transparency. Those promises yielded nothing. Every time, discussions moved toward concrete mechanisms, dates, processes, formal commitments. The negotiations dissolved. When diplomacy stalled entirely, the Abdulhak family tried a different approach. Representatives contacted Martin's parents directly and proposed a financial settlement. The concept of blood money, a monetary payment in exchange for dropping legal proceedings, was not unfamiliar to Shaher Abdulhak personally. He had previously accepted such an arrangement following the death of his own niece. But Odd Petter Magnuson and Kristen Magnuson did not want money. They wanted a courtroom. They wanted their daughter's killer to stand before a judge and answer for what he had done. The offer was refused. Every avenue was closed. As the years accumulated, something unexpected began to happen to the fortress Farouk Abdulhak had retreated into. Yemen itself began to collapse. In 2011, a wave of civil unrest swept the region, eventually forcing the president, a figure with long-standing ties to the Abdulhak family, from power. 3 years later, the country descended into full-scale civil war. The capital city where Farouk Abdulhak was believed to be hiding became subject to routine aerial bombardment. Infrastructure failed. Power supply became erratic. Hospitals were destroyed. Food grew scarce. Many of the wealthy families who had made Sana'a their base evacuated to Europe or the United States. For Farouk Abdulhak, however, every exit was sealed. The Interpol notice made crossing any international border a trip directly into custody. He could not flee the war. He was confined to the family mansion, an opulent estate that had become his cage, while the city outside disintegrated around him. His isolation deepened with a development that no amount of money could prevent. In late 2020, Shaher Abdulhak died following a prolonged battle with cancer. Those closest to him described the final chapter of his life as defined by the son who had ruined it. In his last days, it was said that he removed a photograph of Farouk from his wallet and described him as the heaviest burden he had ever carried. With the patriarch gone, everything shifted. The family began a bitter internal conflict over an inheritance of staggering value. And within that struggle, Farouk Abdulhak's position transformed. He was no longer a son to be defended at any price. He had become a problem, an encumbrance, a potential bargaining piece in someone else's financial negotiation. The carefully constructed refuge around him began, quietly, to crumble. Years of silence followed. Then a breakthrough arrived. And it came not from Scotland Yard, not from diplomatic channels, but from a journalist with a laptop and a determined instinct. Nawal al-Maghafi, a reporter for BBC Arabic, uncovered something that seemed almost farcical for a man who had spent over a decade evading international law enforcement. Farouk Abdulhak was active on Snapchat. Through a network of contacts in Yemen, she obtained a phone number associated with him. She searched it. An account appeared, its profile photograph showing a bald man with a heavy beard, consistent with what Farouk Abdulhak would look like at his current age. She sent a request. Starved of human contact after years of isolation, he accepted almost immediately. What followed was a correspondence that stretched across several months. Farouk Abdulhak presented himself as a cryptocurrency trader. Gradually, incrementally, his guard began to drop. He confided to his new contact that something had happened to him when he was young, a mistake that had permanently closed the door to ever returning to Britain. Eventually, Nawal al-Maghafi steered the conversation toward that mistake directly, and Farouk Abdulhak gave his version of the night Martine Vik Magnussen died. He described it as an accident, something that had occurred during a moment of intimacy, a claim that collapsed against the weight of the evidence gathered 16 years earlier. 43 separate injuries documented on Martine's body, and the unmistakable physical signature of manual strangulation applied with sustained and deliberate force. His admission was not an exoneration. It was for the first time a direct connection between the fugitive's own voice and the act that had destroyed a family, and it was now on record. Then, in March 2022, 14 years after Martine's body had been discovered in that basement, the investigation took a concrete turn on British soil. Officers from Scotland Yard conducted an operation in a London residential area, arresting a woman believed to be in her 60s on suspicion of having assisted an offender. Her identity was not released officially, but every indicator pointed to someone with deep personal ties to the Abdulhak family. The subsequent search of the premises was exhaustive. Floorboards lifted, wall cavities examined, every possible concealment point explored. Investigators were searching for evidence that Farouk Abdulhak's escape and the years of hiding that followed it had been financially sustained through money covertly channeled out of the United Kingdom. Members of the Magnussen family who traveled to London to meet with the investigating team expressed their belief that the woman in custody was Farouk Abdulhak's mother, someone whose devotion to her son had, it appeared, operated entirely above the law. Today, Farouk Abdulhak is past the age of 35. The young man who once moved through London with unlimited resources and the self-assurance of someone who believed consequences were for other people now exists inside a war-shattered city, aging in an isolation that no amount of inherited wealth can relieve. He is alive. And, unlike Martine Vik Magnussen, who was given no opportunity to grow beyond 23, he has had time, only he has spent it in a kind of living erasure, cut off from the world he once inhabited, surrounded by people who no longer view him as worth protecting. The case carries no statute of limitations. The warrant issued in his name remains active, and will remain active for as long as he draws breath outside a British courtroom. Martine Vik Magnussen's parents have not allowed her name to recede into archival silence. Through the Justice for Martine Vik Magnussen Foundation, they have continued pressing governments, legal bodies, and diplomatic channels, refusing to allow geography or accumulated wealth to function as a substitute for accountability. The investigation has only one possible conclusion. It ends in a courtroom in London. Everything else is simply waiting. Thank you for watching until the end. It means a lot. If you enjoyed this case, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a true crime story. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. Your support really helps the channel grow. See you in the next video.